we're getting to the end of the list, and we're gonna make a bit of a change. So far, all of the things on the list of life are more or less applicable to investigating individual organisms. You know, is it a dynamic system? Is it internally organized? Is it capable of reproduction? Has it grown and developed? Does it interact with the environment? All that stuff. Now we have a feature of living things that is only applicable to populations over time. Living things do this, but they do this as groups, and it takes them a while to do this. And that is evolution. If we must have it, couldn't it be based on survival of the sweetest? Now, what does this mean? Population change over time. Well, sometimes this is not a great parallel, but in keeping with something I talked about earlier. So, Italian Americans started as Italians, came to America. New conditions, very different conditions, different language conditions, different economic conditions. Different societal conditions, and they were forced with a lot of challenges. The ones that were ready to deal with the challenges, were able to get through and get along, were much more likely to survive and pass those abilities. In this case, not genetic, it would have been mimetic, but their changes on to their offspring. And over the course of a few generations, you have people that are Italian American, but they're American. Is that the population as a whole has different average features than the population that came in, say, the 1840s. This same thing happens in nature where conditions change, sometimes through transposition, removing something, a small population into a new place, but sometimes conditions, just the environment just changes. And we talked about this before, is that in a variety population, there's going to be some members that are better suited to the new changes and some members that are not so well suited. And if it affects their survival, the ones that are well suited are more likely to live and pass those genetic abilities onto their offspring. The ones that are less suited, more likely to die. Their offspring don't get any of that. And so, how does the population change? The average member of the population changes. You take a step back from the population and you go, so what do we got here? You want to define, a fox, or define a crow, or define a maple tree. You're going to come up with a set of features that apply broadly to all maple trees. Now, you may be standing in front of a maple tree that doesn't exactly fit every one of the lists. Like if you're standing in front of a red maple, you go, well, that's weird. That's a different type of maple. But it is actually, as a species, where red is a reliable member or feature of that. But say, I used to have a fox on my, it would come through my yard a bunch, and it was distinctly gray. It was gray as a gray squirrel. Foxes are not typically gray, but the average fox for the average fox population is red. Individuals are going to vary. In this case, I don't think gray was an advantage or disadvantage, it just was different. So anytime you're looking at the population, you're basically kind of taking a step back and saying, what's the average member of this? And if conditions push a major change in a particular direction, because the change has been pretty major, then after a while, the average member of the population is pretty different from the old average member. Maybe enough for you to go, well, that's not really the same species anymore. At some point, red maples in their history were green. I don't know what it is about the carotenoids that produces the red in the maples that was an advantage under what conditions, but that's what happens. So evolution is driven by conditions. Classically, that's called natural selection, where natural nature was the stand-in word for conditions. And selection is the picking and choosing that, sometimes people that are kind of creationists think, oh, it's all just random. Well, no, it's not. It's very specific. Is that the winners and losers are chosen by the conditions, not actively, consciously, but it's definitely not random. It's the winners and losers in these evolutionary processes is definitely not a random process. Now, the variations that you're dealing with may be somewhat random, but the good variations and the bad variations are definitely a selection process. How quickly does evolution happen? Well, if conditions change dramatically, in some cases, conditions change so dramatically that every member of the population can't deal with it. They all die, right? That happens a lot in the history of the Earth. Extinction happens where conditions change and you don't have any winners, you just have losers. But if there are winners and losers, how quickly your average member of the population changes is very much driven by how quickly the conditions are changing. If the conditions are very stable, I mentioned this in the last bit, if you live in a microenvironment that is very stable over the long haul, then, and you fit into it really well, then you have no real push to change. You look at something like what they call pelagic sharks, open water sharks. They, back way into the fossil record, at least as far as what you can see from fossils, have not changed significantly. But they live in a part of the open water where as long as there's things to bite and eat, that part of the ocean has been stable over a very, very long period of time. They're very well suited to it. They actually, weirdly enough, have evolved to not evolve. Horseshoe crabs that live in the surf zone, our browsers off the bottom in the surf zone. Give me a second here. I pulled this fella out of the surf zone. There's his eye. There's his alien-looking set of feet on the bottom. Very well adapted to browsing off the bottom. They pick stuff up with those front claws, and very well defended from predation. You can find these guys looking pretty much exactly like this, going way, way, way back into the fossil record. They call them living fossils. Well, what you're looking at is an organism very well suited to a microenvironment that has stayed stable. It's moved around with the continents, but doesn't move fast, over a long, long period of time. And one thing about these guys and about pelagic sharks is that if you try to make their DNA mutate, you zap it with radiation or treat it with certain chemicals, their systems of fixing DNA problems, changes in the code, is actually way, way, way better than ours. Is that, we've been victims of changing environments. A certain amount of mutational ability is adaptive, but in their case, changes are not going to be useful. Resisting changes is going to be useful. They actually fix changes to their DNA better, which is why that's why sharks very rarely get cancer. It's not that they have some sort of magical chemical resistance to it. It's built into their DNA systems. So people that tell you, eat this part of the shark to prevent cancers. No. It's like eating somebody's brain in order to pick up their experiences, which people did believe at one point too. Doesn't work. Okay, one thing I'm gonna slip in the bottom here. Charles Darwin originated the idea of evolution by natural selection. Is that the basic tenets kind of came out of his and a few other people's ideas. And so he's kind of the granddaddy of evolutionary theory. He got a bunch of stuff wrong. It was 150 years ago, so of course he got a bunch of stuff wrong. But there was not just natural selection was part of his tenets. There's another thing, that again, badly named, and we're kind of stuck with it. Here's the basic idea. What really makes evolution work isn't just survival, it's passing features on to the next generation, which gradually builds up useful features from the survivors to their offspring, and can change them over time to kind of reflect things that are useful in the conditions that we've changed to, in which case those change conditions need to also be kind of stable. That makes sense, right? You change conditions, but if they're changing all the time, is that there was a change, weirdly enough, in the Galapagos Islands where Darwin did his studies, where they had a very, very long drought. And over the course of like 10 years, they could see evolutionary changes in the plants and the birds, and then the drought went away. And the changes hadn't really stabilized, so it very quickly reverted back to the conditions that existed before the drought. But if the drought had been a persistent change that went on and on and on and on, then the evolutionary changes they were starting to see would have probably stabilized and produced permanent changes in the population. But what's important isn't just survival, it's making offspring. And if you have a feature that improves your odds of reproducing, it's good for reproducing, doesn't really have an effect on survival, then you're going to produce more offspring. If it's something that they can get genetically from you, they're going to produce more offspring. So it selects for reproduction features. Now here's the problem. 150 years ago, sexual reproduction was the only type of reproduction anybody knew about. So it got this term. It's now broader than that. It means basically features that produce reproductive advantages. And asexual reproducers can have those as well. So sexual selection can very much also be a feature in asexual evolution. There's a bacterium that can colonize a new area, like you, and reproduce much faster. There's now viruses are asexual reproducers. Whether they're alive or not, we'll talk about in the next section. But one of the mutational variants of coronavirus 2, COVID-19, the variation appears to produce a much higher ability to move offspring to the next person. It increases contagiousness. It's probably cranking out offspring viruses faster. They haven't figured that out quite yet. But if it's just reproducing and getting them out much faster as a feature of contagiousness, then it's increased its reproductive potential. It's sexual selection in an asexual system. So it doesn't have to be sexual in order to work. And a lot of times people look at this and look at like mate choice. And to be honest, that was what Darwin was looking at when he was first looking at these things, is that, you know, male, females, where there was actually females actively choosing males or males kind of fighting it out to get access to the females. And so, you know, it really, a lot of his descriptions from the 1860s and 70s really were about selection, as in, I pick you. But it's much broader a term now. Okay, that is the list of features that apply to living things. Is that the very last section of this chapter will deal with the things that even biologists can't agree on whether they're alive or not. We're going to talk about the viruses.